We've been talking about this world of meaning that gets made, starting with a child's cry that would then be interpreted by an adult as having some sort of meaning or import. By bringing the child a blanket, you ascribe meaning to an indecipherable cry. You say, this is the cry that says, I'm cold. The child eventually starts to learn that when I cry this way, or when I cry at all, I get a blanket or I get food. What it also gets, though, when it cries, is it gets your attention. It gets your affection. It solicits your care. It provokes your love. The child that cries provokes love from the primary caregiver. And that, as I have said, is insatiable. It can never get enough, which is why sometimes you'll have people crying for something that they do not need, and oftentimes confusing their demands for love as a need. Like the teenager who says, I'll die if I don't have sex. You ain't gonna die if you don't have sex. It's not a need. But it feels so pronounced, the way that love and sex get bound up in youth, that it is experienced as a need. We're not gonna go too far into that. It's the subject of another course. We're trying to ramp up to the psychoses and to their basic constitutive structure. To that end, I want to shift and talk a little bit more about child development. Eventually, the parent or the primary caregiver is not okay with crying, because eventually the infant becomes the child, and the child learns to speak like the adult in the mother tongue. In other words, as time goes on, and as the child is introduced to language, we'll just pause on that issue for now because it's a very complicated one. One of the things that they learn is a new way to express their needs, not in the field of a base material animalistic cry, but instead at the register of language, in a sociological field of meanings that precede the child, a world of language that is not of their own creation. You see, whatever your first language was, your mother tongue, it was your mother's tongue before it was yours. You weren't born and then the world decided, let's create a brand new language that we're all going to learn to speak in honor of the birth of this child. No. You were born into a linguistic community that preceded you. The words and their meanings may have changed since you were born, but the language itself has been around long before you were born into it. In other words, as the child grows older, they are asked, in fact, demanded, to no longer cry like a baby and instead to start speaking like a proper young man or lady all too often. Emphasis on the all too often part. But this is what happens. And the parent does something very simple in these moments. The primary caregiver does something very simple in these moments to reinforce this. The child starts to cry in the store, and the primary caregiver leans over to them and says, I can't understand you when you're crying like that. Use your words. Tell me what it is that you actually want. And the child, of course, is so caught up in what's going on, and they try and struggle with this. And you've seen this in stores, and you may even remember it from your siblings or your own childhood, where the child is so wrapped up in the cry, but they're still struggling to get the words out that it sounds something like this. I want to, he hit me, or something like that. In these moments, you can see the two worlds, biological and sociological, mixing together. And then the parent says, thank you for using your words. Now I know what you want, because now we don't talk about need and demand. We start talking about wants all of a sudden. Now I know what you want, and you can have ice cream after dinner, or whatever the case may be. Or we're not going to buy that. We're going to get this instead. It's a healthier choice, and blah, blah, blah. The story goes on, but the point is the same here. The child passes from a material animalistic organism expressing their need at the level of a cry to a properly linguistified, socialized, civilized being that can now express their needs in the field of language, in the field of words. And that is no easy feat. A lot of times when children are under stress, they do something called regression. They may relapse into some kind of baby talk. Maybe they kind of like are fascinated with their little stuffed animals and kind of hold on to them maybe longer than you think they should. There are ways, in other words, that they cling to the lost experience of being an infant. This could be the child that sucks its thumb past the point that you think it's appropriate. This could be the child that whenever you give them a big hug, they raise the pitch of their voice and they say, "Ooh, Daddy, I just so love snuggling with you, do." And they relapse into a kind of baby voice that isn't one that they normally speak when they're at school or with their friends. You can also see this even in adults. You come in for the hug and your partner goes into a high kind of like goo goo gaga baby voice, a little bit of baby talk. It's because the loss of that primordial, purely animalistic experience is so profound that we have these little regressions in everyday life from childhood to adulthood. And you may even call it out sometimes in the heat of the moment. You may tell your child, "Stop acting like a baby." You may tell your partner, "Stop acting like a baby." You may find yourself telling one of your parents, "You're acting like a child." That can happen. If it hasn't happened to you yet, it just might still. Everybody has these regressive moments. And part of the reason why that is that there's a very profound loss that's experienced as the child is brought into language. Now, what is this a loss of? What is lost when the child enters the realm of language and is subsequently split between their animalistic self that still has needs and their sociological being that now has the resource of language that it can use to house those needs and express them to others? This basic split in human subjectivity between a biological self and a sociological self, an embodied self and a linguistified self, is crucial to what we're going to be talking about here. And that's where we'll turn next.